Let's get started for our event this evening. We are very honored to have with us again Swami Padmanabha. He was here to talk about his newest book, Evolution in Divine Love, the eternal becoming of God, soul, and matter. And um, and so Swami is in the is it Gaudiya? Is that how you say, or Gaudiya Vaishnava? I'm gonna not be able to say. You're gonna have to explain, correct my pronunciation of your tradition, Swami. But he's been part of this tradition since the age of 19, and has been studying these scriptures for many years, and so has several books that he's already written, and has been traveling the world and lecturing and teaching all over the place, and leads retreats, and is a very inspiring person in bringing, I think, bringing a beautiful message from his tradition to the world. So please welcome Swami Padmanabha, and we are eager to hear what you're bringing to us this evening.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Thank you, Jared. Thank you, everyone at Process Faith, for inviting me for the event, and welcome and thank you so much to each one of you connected present today. My pleasure to be sharing a few thoughts today about my last book, Evolution in Divine Love. First, maybe I'd like to share a few words about my tradition for those who are not that introduced to it, since many times the broader term Hinduism may be invoked to refer to whatever spiritual happens under in the Indian subcontinent. But as you may know, probably Hinduism is more of an broader umbrella term, and many times also understood from the West as mostly exclusively in connection to monism or even to polytheism. And we have all of that and more under the umbrella of Hinduism. But there is also a theistic monotheistic line with various branches in the umbrella of Hinduism called Vaishnavism. So interestingly enough, Vaishnavism in terms of numbers is the third largest monotheistic religion in the world, with more than 600 million followers. And like most Hindu schools, Vaishnavism, takes for granted that when we are talking about the divine God, we are talking about the infinite. We are dealing with the infinite. So therefore, we cannot put God into boxes. We cannot label, or as I like to say, we cannot colonize infinity by reducing it to one definition or one name, or belonging to only one school, one tradition, one form, one holy book. So from that perspective, Vaishnavism, my tradition, and again, the Hindu umbrella in general has a very open idea of the divine is infinite, and it can have so many names and forms and manifest in so many traditions. So Vaishnavism, as the monotheistic expression of Hinduism, could be referred to as what I like to call polymorphic monotheism. In other words, one God, monotheism, polymorphic, many forms. One same absolute, manifesting in endless names, forms, traditions. So we are in that sense very taking that for granted from day one in the Vaishnava tradition. Of course, we are dealing with the infinite here. So my particular line inside the tradition of Vaishnavism is called Gaudiya Vaishnavism, as Sherry mentioned in the introduction. Also sometimes called Chaitanya Vaishnavism, since it was founded by Chaitanya, or Sri Chaitanya, who is considered in the tradition as an avatar or a divine descent of God on earth. So the philosophical framework of my tradition is, I will say, so many things could be said, but I will say it's non-dual and it's panentheistic. Not pantheistic, but panentheistic. And the two of them interrelate, right? Non-dual in which sense? Because also the word non-duality could be read in a very reductionistic way. Non-dual not in the sense of you ultimately everything is reduced to one singular ultimate reality, and there's nothing else apart from that, and there's no individual existence for the soul, no interaction with the divine, not that type of non-duality, which I will call radical non-dualism, but the tradition is non-dual in the sense that everything exists inseparably from everything else. Everything is interconnected, interrelated. Everything exists in relationship with everything else. That's why I like to say we are relatives with everything and everyone else, because we exist in relationship. So sharing a common center, many theistic traditions, we call that center God. So in that sense, we are non-dual. Nothing exists in isolation. No man is an island. And this concept of non-duality, of in the inseparability and relationality of reality, is naturally connected to the notion of panentheism, right? Panentheism, which means God in everything and everything in God, which doesn't necessarily mean that God is everything in every single sense of the word and everything is God, but there are individuality for the divine, for us, and so on and so forth. But there is a mutual interpenetration, if you will, and interconnectedness with the divine in the center. So my Vaishnava tradition, apart from being non-dual and being panentheistic, all this is played out in the metaphysical framework of the tradition, which in Sanskrit is known as Achintya Bheda Abheda Tattva. I'm sorry for not being using the slides and invoking all these Sanskrit terms. I'm not much of a slide person. And I promise I won't be bringing too much more Sanskrit terminology here today. So Achintya Bheda Abheda Tattva basically means that the nature of reality, or tattva, is a paradoxical and simultaneous achintya bheda ved, unity and diversity. So the nature of reality is paradoxical, simultaneous coexistence of unity and diversity in all of reality. So in one sense, everything is one in the sense that everything is interconnected. Nothing is isolated from anything else. Reality is relational. But at the same time, every one of us, according to our tradition, have an eternal individuality, individual existence. And that individual existence allows for interaction, for relationality, for the possibility of love. A word for that in Sanskrit will be bhakti. My tradition sometimes is known as a bhakti tradition, a devotional tradition. So for us, the idea of love and interaction with the divine is very important. So for that to happen, we consider it's crucial to keep individuality in eternity. And that diversity, that me and God, at the same time becomes one in dynamic union in love. Not only between us and God, but between us and everything else as well, right? With God, or the sweet absolute, as I like to refer to God, in the center. So I have tried to articulate all of the above and some other topics in my recent book, third book, which was published a few months ago, Evolution and Divine Love, the eternal becoming of God, soul, and matter, that we are briefly introducing today. So the basic theme of this work is basically that, the totality of reality is, as I already said, relational, and therefore it's in constant dialogue, it's in constant conversation with everything else. But also that the nature of that dialogue, the nature of that interconnectedness is ever evolving, is always growing, expanding. There is a freshness and a newness to it. Since according to the Vaishnava school, and not only to the Vaishnava school, of course, but the nature of love is ever evolving. The nature of the divine is ever evolving. And as a natural extension of that, our own nature as souls, our own potential, spiritual potential, and even the nature of the world of matter, nature, all of that remains in a state of permanent disclosure. And those are the divisions of my book. The book basically has four main chapters. The first one dedicated to love, second one to God, third one to the soul, the self, and the fourth one to matter, the depths of matter. And in many ways, of course, this is quite related to process thought, and process theology. Interestingly enough, I I became more informed in further detail about Alfred North Whitehead and many other process authors only a few years ago, before writing my book, but relatively recently. But doing so, very interestingly, helped me to rediscover in one sense, how my own tradition has been in its own way talking about these ideas of relationality and perpetual newness in its own way for some thousands of years. So in one sense, my book is in many ways an attempt to show how Hinduism in general, Vaishnavism, my tradition more in particular, perfectly coexist with schools traditions, if you will, like process thought or process theology, and similar other perspectives that make a case for an evolutionary and dynamic reality. So, of course, my book is primarily centered around my Vaishnava tradition, but also throughout my book, I refer to what I like to call sister traditions. I don't like to call them other traditions. It creates a very thick wall to sister traditions, and there I try to show basically the universality of these principles by referring to the holy scriptures in my tradition, but also to other sister lineages. So the title of the book is Evolution in Divine Love. And for me, the title has twofold meaning, twofold implications at least. One is that divine love is in perpetual evolution, which may be the most obvious idea we may get when we hear the expression evolution in divine love. But also I like to put it the other way around and try to explain that evolution, it finds itself in a state of divine love. Evolution is in love. Evolution has fallen in love, if I dare to express myself more poetically. And the book is very poetic, although I will say it's mostly theological and philosophical. But when we speak about love, at least in my tradition, we say poetry is the final resource that we need to embrace at one point. So in the same way that we may describe that someone has fallen in love, that person is in love with someone. So for me, the principle of evolution too has fallen in love, so to say, and therefore it's, for all intents and purposes, is in love. So as a result, we have evolution in divine love. So as I said, I divide the book in 4 chapters, 4 parts. Love, God, soul, matter. So next, briefly, I will highlight some of the main points from each one of these 4 sections of the book, making some connections also with sister traditions. So the first part is about love. So first of all, I try to define, of course, love, because many times, as much as you can define love, I always love to remind myself of a poetry by Rumi when he says, when I try to even write the word love, the pen broke, right? What to speak of trying to define it. But at the same time, it's a word that we use so much, and sometimes we may use it for anything and everything, and in one sense, it starts to have no meaning in one sense. So based on a definition of love coming from my tradition, I try to put that in contemporary language and describe love as a profoundly intentional act, which is free of ulterior motives and which is aimed at promoting the best for the one we love. So those are kind of the main ideas in this particular working definition, if you will. An intentional act, very profoundly intentional, free of ulterior motives, separate agenda, and favorably having the intentionality of promoting the best for the person we love. Of course, again, for us, God is the center of that, but also it extends beyond God. So for us, the goal of life many times is defined as developing divine love, but divine love is loving God plus loving all the things that exist in relationship with God, which is everything. Like I always love to remember one line that Ilia Delia will say. She will say something like, we are invited to fall in love with the totality of reality in an absolute way. So for me, that's a beautiful, way more expansive way of just saying love God. Fall in love with the totality of reality in an absolute way. I know it's a high ideal, but it's beautiful to have high ideals as much as we may fall short of them on a daily basis. And they're ever evolving. So they become higher and higher and deeper, but also broader and more generous. So in the Vaishnava tradition, again, true love, real love, as we have just tried to define, is inherently dynamic, is in constant growth, it's always exceeding its own quote unquote limits. An important point that I try to make in my book is that true love has no opposite. No? Sometimes people say the opposite of love is fear, the opposite of love is hate, the opposite of love is indifference or whatever. But if we speak about what we may say divine love, sacred love, pure love, such love is so loving that it has no opposite. It can only become more of what it already is. So that for me is an important pillar in my presentation and explanation of love. Real love is such that it has no opposite. In the same way that you go to the planet sun, there is no shadow there. The shadow is over here, but if you are in the sun, there's so much light. No? So in the same way, if we speak about love as a sun, there's no opposite. It's just more and more of what it already is. Now, it makes me think of mystical Christianity and Gregory of Nyssa using this notion of epectasis, which means the unceasing evolution in eternal happiness. So for me, that's part of the nature of love. For me, in our tradition, that despite any obstacles or challenges, love can only become more of what it already is. Love can only increase. It's uncontainable. Or it's unconditional. Sometimes unconditional love we think is something given beyond deserving. But for me, unconditional love means no matter the conditions, love can only expand. Love can only become more love. And in my book, I try to explain that, saying that this is the case because love, in our tradition, we say love is a potency, the most powerful of all forces. And every potency has potential. So every potency has the potential to become more of what it already is. So if love is love and is loving and is all that it is, it has the potential of continuous, ongoing expansion in that deeper and deeper layers of that. So the more love one possesses, the more one can hint at how much more love is possible. Something like that. And that creates a very interesting paradoxical scenario, because if love is ongoing and ever expanding and has the potential of, again, being in permanent disclosure, you can never say, I have it fully. No? The more love you have, the more you realize how much more love there is. So that creates deep humility, right? Again, you can never dare to colonize love. And also it creates a very interesting sense of what I call sacred dissatisfaction, right? It creates its own fulfillment, of course. It creates its own overflowing, but it creates a dissatisfaction, sacred one, in the way of further thirst or hunger for more love. So that keeps the whole thing on the move. Someone who really loves is always looking for actualized further love and further potential for love. And it creates this deep humility. There's a famous statement by Sri Chaitanya, the founder of my tradition, and he has been described by many historians and many people from different traditions like one of the most intense personalities in the history of humanity, exhibiting deep ecstatic symptoms of divine love. But he himself will say famously, me, there is not even the aroma of divine love. Like the example, if you have a little camphor in a box and you take the camphor out, at least the aroma remains. He will say, me, there is not even the aroma of divine love. But he will be showing such symptoms of divine love. So that was the paradox. He has so much love that he was glimpsing at how much more love could be had. And that created the paradoxical subjective experience that I have no love. In comparison to how much more love is waiting for me to embrace, what I have is not so much. So that creates a very natural humility and thirst for more. So, and since love is a goal that we can always attain further, so to say, in that sense, love is, I would say, not only the goal of life for us, but we will say in our tradition, love is the goal of life even for God. who is love, but who continues to actualize his own potential as love. So the real goal of life has to be of such nature that it has to include everyone, God included. So everyone is pursuing a new level of experience in love. So that takes us to the second part of the book, talking about God. So I start with love because for me that's the foundational reality. And that's the foundation, an initial ideal way to start speaking about who God is, because sometimes we have not very loving ideas about the divine. So I try to make the case for love first. So when we talked about God, and I say God is love, we have already talked about love, and we can relate to a loving God or to a God that is love. And I refer to God in my book, I use mostly the epithet, the sweet absolute, trying to address the absolute, but a sweet one, a loving one, an ever-expanding one. There's many names in our tradition to refer to God, hundreds and thousands. One of the main names used in the scriptures, especially in metaphysical treatises, known like the Upanishads, is Brahman. Brahman. And interestingly enough, the meaning of the word Brahman, which is again one of the main words for God, comes from the root Brahm, Sanskrit root Brahm, which means that which is great and expansive, and also make others great and expansive. So that's basically one of the main names for God, and the meaning of the name is that which grows, that which is expanding, and makes everything else to grow and expand as well. So it's this very definition of God immediately brings the notion of ongoing evolution. I'm thinking about Meister Eckhart, again going back to mystical Christianity for a moment, which I love to flirt with a lot because there are so many beautiful parallels. And he will similarly assert that God is the newest thing there is and the youngest thing there is. And again, beautifully in our tradition, we have similar parallels and names for the divine like Nava Yovanam, Nitya Kishore, which in Sanskrit means eternally young, ever fresh, ever new. So God is ever new, ever fresh. At the same time, I try to balance the equation in my presentation. God is described in the scripture as changeless in many ways. But one is not contradicting the other. No, God is changeless in the sense that God is always God, in the sense that according to our tradition, God does not go through the different, let's put it this way, existential crises that we may go through as humans. God is changeless in the sense that he's always evolving in love. That doesn't change. As they will say, the only constant is change. So there's a changelessness and immutability to the divine in a way that doesn't contradict his ever-evolvingness. And also I address in my book the notion of perfection in this connection, because many times we will say, well, but God is perfect. So if someone is perfect, we generally assume all potentials are actualized. So if someone attains perfection, it assumes that it was not perfect to begin with. But I try to explain how, from the perspective of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and I will say in Hinduism in general, God's perfection is not a fixed maximum. No, it's not like a dead end. But real perfection must include the possibility of ongoing expansion in love on the foundation of a perfection that was there from day zero, so to say, to begin with, but that can always attain newer levels and depths of loving perfection. And also in my book, I address the famous, well-known omnis in regards to God, omnipotence, omniscience, and so on. I'm just mentioning it briefly here. There's a detailed treatise there. But I also share how Gaudiya Vaishnavism presents a notion of the divine when, for example, omnipotence is not considered as hyperbolic as it may be viewed in classical theism. So this also goes quite close to Thomas J. Ort's notion of omnipotence. We did a podcast together on this. Because in our tradition, there's many important points like the soul has inherent free will, love's nature is voluntary. We speak about the love karma in that connection. So at the same time, if God is love and love is voluntary and we have free will, omnipotence could be like hyperbolically absolute to the point that our free will is canceled and the voluntary nature of love is canceled, because if that happens, if love is canceled, God stops being God because God is love, and so on and so forth, right? So I try to explain a little bit about this, as well as notions like omniscience, and I speak about the nuanced sense of omniscience, because interestingly in our tradition, like in many, like in process thought and so on and so forth, we will say, okay, and there are differences of opinions, to be fair, in my tradition, like there are in Christianity and any other tradition about any given point. So I don't want to say everyone in my lineage agrees on every single thing that I'm writing on in my book, but there is enough part of the community thinking like this. Of course, omniscience, okay, God knows all past or present and all potential possibilities of the future, but not exactly what will actually be happening at any given case in any given moment. And different ways to explain that, but in the language of our tradition, we will say, okay, God is described as love. One word for that in Sanskrit also is rasa, which interestingly means juice, which means something that flows. So love is always flowing, moving. And then the tradition will say rasa sar chamatkar. This rasa, this love, the essence of it is astonishment. So our tradition emphasizes a lot wonder, awe, astonishment as the essence of love, as the essence of the experience of love that God is. So if God is love and the essence of love is astonishment, omniscience has to be is described in such a way that God's astonishment is kept in place. Because if God will know everything in advance, there's no place for surprise. There's no place for wonder. There's no place for astonishment. So in the ever-evolvingness of love, I try to depict all these different omnis in the context of a love that is ever-evolving and an absolute that is updated in love. That's the name actually of the second part of the book. Can God be updated? And of course, in that context, if God himself, again, doesn't know the specific outcomes of certain things, for us to relate to such a person, we also are invited in a similar way to unknow certain things, not to be extremely certain about our ideas of the divine, especially if we are dealing with a God that is constantly being updated in love. Again, we have to keep the pace of that ever-evolvingness. It's always 2 steps ahead. So we should be very humbled and invited to constantly unlearn God. Like I always recall what my friend and mentor, Father Richard Rohr, he will say, the last experience of God is usually the greatest obstacle to the next experience of God. So it's not only that we may need to deconstruct ideas about God or beliefs about God, but even genuine experiences that we may have had, which are totally beautiful and real, but now we are ready for a new experience. So if we get too much nostalgic and attached to the previous one, we may not be able to keep up with an ever-evolving God. So this applies, of course, unlearning God to relearn God. This applies to the divine, but also this applies to who we are as souls, to be willing to constantly rediscover ourselves. So that takes us to part 3 of my book, 3rd chapter, talking about mapping the soul's unbroken potential. That's the title of the 3rd chapter, speaking about the self. In Sanskrit, we will call this the Atman, or the soul, or a unit of consciousness. So one word, and I promise I won't bring too many more Sanskrit terminology here, but one more word in regards to how the soul is described in Sanskrit in our tradition is tatashta. So tatashta means something like we are a unit of potential, going back to the idea of potential. We cannot be described outside of all that we can be. Who we are is all that we can become in our brightest potential in love. So it's not that we have potential, but we are our potential. I think Albert Einstein is saying something like that. When analyzing anything, you cannot analyze that separate from all that that thing can become. So we cannot define who we are without considering all that we can be. Again, the eternal becoming of the soul in divine love. And that's a constant ongoing invitation to, again, die to versions of ourselves to be born to new ones. And this is interestingly played out in the Sanskrit term for immortality, which is amrita. And amrita includes the word mritya, which means death. So if you want to embrace immortal, eternal life, you need a type of death is included in that, a type of death to an outdated version of myself. So I can rediscover myself in my potential, ongoing potential of love. So in my Vaishnava tradition, we will consider that if a soul is trying to embrace a life of love, ever evolving love in connection to the divine, that lifestyle, basically that constitutes both the means as well as the goal. Our goal is to love, and the way to reach there is to love here and now, because the reach there is not a finish, again, an end point, it's an ongoing disclosure. So in that sense, we will say, if we are already living a life of love, learning to love, trying to love, we are already doing what we want to do forever. So in that sense, for us, the notion of salvation disappears. Because if you're already doing what you want to do for eternity, you're already in eternity in one way. Salvation is already happening. And we like to think not so much, and I make a case in my book about it, we don't like to see salvation in negative terms. What I'm being saved from, but what I'm being saved for. And that's a real question. I'm saved for giving myself, dedicating myself deeper and deeper in love. So in one sense, we could say we are already saved, but at the same time, if salvation means living a life of love, you will be never fully saved in the sense that you can always be more saved, more embracing a new depths of love. So at the end of the day, the kingdom of God, as in the world talk in Christianity, is a state of consciousness, no? And it can be embraced in the here and now, or nowhere at all. It all begins here and now. Okay, just summarizing a few thoughts regarding the third part, and just to conclude a few thoughts on the fourth chapter of my book, which is about material energy. It's called The Depths of Matter. So matter is not mere superficiality or mere inert stuff, but there are depths to matter. In Sanskrit, we will use this terminology Shakti to refer to matter. Shakti means, again, potency or energy. So energy is always synonymous with something energetic, something alive. So matter is alive. As I mentioned in my book, that there are different ways of being alive. If someone may say, I'm looking at that chair or that whatever so-called inert stuff, it doesn't look alive. The so-called inertness of matter merely indicates another way of being alive. There are so many ways. Whatever is alive is evolving. So I try to make the point that not only matter is alive and evolving, but also that because of that, and because of its intrinsic connection to a sacred center, matter is deeply holy, deeply sacred. And again, many times in the name of religion, we have done very good, quote unquote, job into putting the divinity as an utterly otherworldly being and seeing this world as utterly profane, as an obstacle to the divine, and conceiving the whole spiritual practice as an evacuation plan into the afterlife. And no wonder we have the ecological crisis we have in big part because of what religion taught. So I think there is a big need to reclaim the sacredness of matter. So I spent some time in that chapter trying to make that point. The ever-evolving God, the ever-evolving love is fully present in matter. Our scriptures will say God is present in every atom, in the space between every atom, or more poetically put, the whole of creation is oozing with the presence of the divine. Every atom is an embassy of God. And my Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition also tries to give a very sacred background to the material creation. There's one famous aphorism in the Vedanta Sutra, say Lokavatu Lila Kaivalyam, which basically means God's own love life explodes and takes the form of material creation. So the whole of the cosmos is a byproduct of God's heart overflowing, if I may use that type of example. The scripture says like a drunken person, drunken, intoxicated in divine love, and is celebrating in a very exuberant way, and the overflowing of that manifests in this world. No? So rather than speak about creatio ex nihilo in Latin, we will say creatio ex amore. No? Creation springs forth out of love. As God's heart evolves, matter not only manifests, but matter evolves in tandem to accommodate God's own evolution in his own heart. In Christianity, of course, they will use the term kenosis, like God's self-emptying of his inner being and taking the form of the world. Or Meister Eckhart using the term bullitio and ebullition, like boiling over. Or I like always to recall Julian of Norwich, where she will say like God is wrapping all of creation in love. Or Pseudo Dionysius, that's one that I love. He will say that creation is an erotic outpouring. That's very much in line with our own tradition, which conceives the divine also in terms of the divine couple, divine feminine and divine masculine, interacting in romantic loving exchange. So an erotic outpouring as a result of that manifesting as creation. So considering all of the above, basically Vaishnavism, my tradition concludes that nothing is actually dead in this material world. Matter is very alive, very evolving, very sacred. Matter is eternal, we will say. For us, matter cannot ultimately die. It can only change form. But as a Shakti, we conceive it as an eternal energy, without beginning, without end, just moving. So that will be basically the idea. If something is made of, in terms of matter, and something is made of infinity, aliveness, eternality, it's also ever evolving. And matter is ever evolving because love, God, and us are possessed of these same attributes, and therefore everything else does so by extension in their own unique way. And one final idea that comes to mind that I also include in my book, if this is the case, if the totality of reality is in its own way evolving, growing, moving, then it is the right and it is the duty of every mystical school, every spiritual lineage to bear witness to that, to remain ever evolving themselves in order to bear witness to the perpetual unfolding of reality. So for that, every tradition has to remain dynamic, alive, vibrant. I always love the example of Jesus talking to his own disciples saying, you will do greater things than the ones I did. I wonder what must they have thought at that time, but that speaks about the dynamism of the spiritual revelation and transmission. The example of the wineskins he's given, we call that parampara in our tradition, or the principle of sometimes known as disciplic succession from master to student, and so on and so forth, passing the knowledge, and in an ongoing conversation, as we began saying the beginning of today's conversation, the whole of reality is relational, conversational, dialogical. So anyhow, my book has been just one of many attempts to articulate this nature and trying to be part of that ongoing dialogue and conversation that reality is all about. A fresh, ongoing, ever evolving conversation. So, and today's meeting is part of that. So, very grateful and happy to be part of that. And I'm putting to rest my sharing now. And I don't know if there is anything, someone may have any questions or comments, something you may like to explore further.
Yeah, wow, that was just so rich. What a beautiful summary of your book. Of course I read it several months ago when you sent me, the manuscript to read and loved it, but it's been a while, so it was so
Mhm.
wonderful to have this refresher and be immersed in it again. Um, you
Yeah.
said so many things that I wrote down, and I loved when you said that every atom is an embassy of God. That's
Yeah.
just that's a quotable quote. I'm gonna be making a graphic with your quote with your name on it to to post on my socials because it's
Yeah.
just so beautiful. Um,
It came
and
to me. No copyrights. I mean, all copyrights go to the sweet absolute ultimately.
oh, very good. And I love the idea too of creatio ex amore and that erotic outpouring. That was pseudo Dionysus that said
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow, because that's quite a long time ago. And so,
Yeah,
well, of course.
yeah, I read that one from Ilya Delio first time, and
Oh,
I
okay.
immediately couldn't avoid relating it to how in our tradition we will think in very similar ways. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, and so many, of course, of the Christian mystics do use that erotic language when talking about God. And
yeah,
Rumi, of course, I mean that's why I love so much the mystical poets
yeah,
because that's the language. That is when you're in that immersion, that's the language, and it's so gorgeous.
yeah, yeah. And again, I love poetry. I don't dare to describe myself as a poet, though that's a realistic aspiration. But yeah,
Yeah,
I found that many parts of my book are poetic because not because I have these giant poetic skills, but just because I'm trying to speak about something that demands poetry, basically.
right,
It demands poetic articulation because there's no other way to speak about this thing. So,
right.
yeah.
That's true. Well, let's take any questions or comments from those who are listening today. If you want to, if you can raise your digital hand, that'd be easiest because then I can spot you easily. But if you'd like to put your question in the chat, you can do that and I'll read it out. Or if you want to just wave your hand, I'd love to hear from you.
I I just finished reading your book the other day, uh, because I'm going to be one of the participants in Ortline
Mm.
26 for your book.
Oh, pleasure to meet you, Tim.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Mm.
And it was really fun to read. There's just a few small points I'd like to ask you about, mainly in things you said tonight. So there might be two or three little quick questions instead of one big broad question. Um, you mentioned the word avatar. Would Jesus Christ in Christianity, the incarnation of Christ, would Christ be considered, and that would that be an avatar? Would Christ be an avatar of God, or what would?
Yeah, in brief, I would say yes. Of course, there is a breaking down of the notion of avatar, and our tradition speaks about different types of avatar, which different, how to say, missions, if you will, or different forms of empowerment or functions in the divine descent. But yeah, generally we will speak about Jesus as one form of avatar. Generally, yeah, I don't want to torture all of you with further Sanskrit terminology, but yeah, it's a form of avatar called Shakti Avesh avatar. Yeah.
And so you talked about matter being permanent, matter not being something that will pass away, matter being eternally evolving too.
Mm.
So does that mean our afterlives will be in an environment that includes matter? And will it, I presume you would think that it would evolve over time so that the things that matter, how we interact with matter now might be very different in the afterlife. What do you have a reaction to that?
I do, yeah. Well, basically, cosmologically speaking, our tradition will speak about entertain the notion of a multiverse. So, in that context, and of course, karma and reincarnation are there. So, and depending how we live this particular life, our next life will be attaining one realm or another, we'll say, and there are different possibilities also in our scriptures. There are different realms, not only planet Earth, but other realms which also are composed of matter, but there are different degrees of, how to say, proportions of the material elements present in each abode. This one is called planet Earth. So Earth is a pretty prominent element here, but we will hear about other planets where the element of fire or the element of air or is more prominent. So there are other realms that will even speak in terms of psychic matter and not so much like physical matter as we know it. So yeah, I mean, it all depends where Bhagavad Gita, one of our main texts, will say, depending of our state of consciousness, we will attain a next destination accordingly. But no matter where we go on which part of the multiverse, still the principle stays, which is an ongoing evolution.
Mm.
And you did mention reincarnation today, and also you mentioned it a couple of times in the book. So I was just going to ask a little about that. Um, will we always reincarnate, or is there a point where we stop reincarnating and go on to something else?
Yeah, sounds simple, but it's a very interesting question. There are more than one way to reply to that question. I will be brief. Each question deserves its own lecture, so I'm trying to be brief. But there are ways that we can speak about stopping the reincarnation cycle, sometimes called as samsara, and depicting the entrance of an eternal realm when there is no further need to reincarnate. And again, reincarnation is never seen as, or karma, which is attached to reincarnation, is never seen as a form of chastisement or punishment, but always like learning and being put in a situation to learn whatever lessons we need. But apart from the idea of someone becoming, let's say, enlightened and transcending the cycle of reincarnation, there are many enlightened people, very much like in Buddhism, the bodhisattvas, which will voluntarily choose to come over and over again. And we have many prayers in our own texts which refer to that. I'm now writing my next book, which is revolving around the principle of unconditional love. And I include many of those prayers that, again, so some people is equipped, so to say, to live the reincarnation cycle, but out of voluntary love and compassion, they choose to stay. And again, we will say externally, physically, they may be here, but in terms of their inner development, they are beyond, so to say, the conditioning. Yeah, I
Thank
hope
you.
that helps.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Looking forward to our meeting in a few days.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tim. Hannah, I see you have a question. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, wow. I'm almost afraid to say anything because everything that's transpired has been so beautiful. But I did have a question, specifically about the part where you talked about how your last um experience of God kind of getting in the way of your next. And I find I also like to write poetry. And part of that is part of the challenge for me, I guess, is the romanticizing of for lack of a better word. I mean, the awe basically of an experience like that. And just like savoring that and enjoying that and reveling in that and, pulling it apart and looking at it from so many angles is part of the joy. But then I worry that that can get in the way of, welcoming what's next. And I'm wondering if you have any kind of relationship with that, or if you have any experience with that at all.
Beautiful question. And by the question itself, yeah, I can see how you will make a very nice poet. So please go on with we all have that potential, actually.
It's true.
So what I mentioned regarding the last experience of God can be the greatest obstacle to the next experience. Sorry if I didn't clarify enough. I was not so much referring to the experience and to itself, but to our attachment to that experience being in a certain way and wanting to keep God being that person we experience it that way, which can happen even in any relationship we may have with anyone. If you just want a favorite version of that person and you want to put that person, like limit the person to that version, preferred version, that becomes suffocating and dysfunctional and toxic. So we have to allow the person to be all that the person can be, and actually hopefully to facilitate that becoming. But in connection to what you mentioned, if I will say that if we, let's say we have an experience of God 10 years ago, I wouldn't say just like you cannot go back there, you are just ready for the new one, because any genuine experience of God is by nature, I would say, unlimited and infinite. So you can also go back to that experience and rediscover that in so many new levels. So for me, the main problem is not so much don't go back to some previous experience, but do not get attached to limit the divine, the unlimited, to one particular way we are experiencing Him. But if that's not there, we can even go back to something we have experienced long time ago and still rediscover that anew and afresh and stay there for forever in one sense, right? because any experience of the divine is not part of the past by definition, but it's always existing in an eternal now. So we may think I had that experience 10 years ago, but that's something one sense beyond time, timeless. So yeah, some thoughts
Thank you.
in that regard. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Okay, Abhinandana, I see your hand. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes. So my question is, you were talking about how love has no opposites, and so how does that include fear? But also mostly my question is about when there's fear of not fully recognizing God's unconditional love. How do you enter deeper into trust, like when there is fear?
Mm-hmm. So when I say true love has no opposite, of course, I'm not denying the reality of fear. I'm just saying that when someone is possessed of true love, again, one enters in one has a glimpse of what true love is, and you can realize even if there is fear, there is hate, there are all these so-called opposites to love. Love is always conquering them all. True love. So in that sense, there is no opposite to love. There is no contrary to true love. True love can always, I mean, just thinking about the times, crazy times we are living, and many things that are not love. But in the midst of all those not loving things, love comes, and you can see the power of that. And in that sense, when true love manifests, there's nothing that can really oppose to that in any substantial way. So that's the intention of true love has no opposite. A real love is just all conquering, and whatever challenges or obstacles come on the way, it's just making love even more strong. And regarding the second part of your question, if I understood it correctly, if we have fear, can you rearticulate that, Abhinandana? Which was the second part briefly?
Yes, it was about how to enter deeper into trust when there's fear. Like, I remember
Uh-huh.
you were telling it's not about becoming fearless and fearless, but it's about entering deeper into trust. So,
Yeah, of course, it's a gradual process, and each one of us is a different case. And some of us may have, if some of us come with lots of, I don't know, trauma and situation, I cannot just force you to, hey, trust, no, like you're a safe space. We may be with all the defense mechanisms activated, so it may be a gradual process of encountering unconditional love and acceptance, and discovering such a thing is possible for those who may have never experienced that in their life. And of course, as one person once asked me, well, if someone never experienced unconditional love in this life, how much you can talk to them about God loves you unconditionally? And for them, that will be a very ethereal, abstract idea. And it's like, yeah, of course. So we have to embody that for that person. Right? So that becomes undeniable. You can give that person a very tangible experience of what it means to be seen, held, accepted in a non-judgmental, unconditional way. And even in the beginning, that person may be defensive to that because it's something new, something that the person cannot relate to because they have no prior point of reference to that. So it may be a whole process for the person to put the shields down and to open themselves to that, and gradually trusting more and more, and fear being replaced by trust and love. So it may be a process, but hopefully we can begin somewhere wherever we are.
Mm,
Yeah.
thank you
beautiful.
so
Thank you.
Any other questions? Abdi writes in chat saying it's very noisy there, so they can only type. I'm a Muslim, and in Islamic spiritual tradition, Sufism, there is a famous hadith about love and the desire to be known. And then is quoting, I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known, so I created creation in order to be known. May I hear your commentary on this?
Okay. Thank you, Adbi, for the commentary. And I personally am a lover of Sufism as well. I really enjoy. I mean, I'm friends with many Sufi practitioners and teachers and poets and Hafiz and Rumi and whatnot. I'm deeply circular dancing and dervish and so on. So I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known. So I created creation in order to be known. So my commentary on that. Uh, hmm. Well, a few things come. What comes naturally, spontaneously, of course. In my own tradition, one name for love, how love is treated in the Bhagavad Gita is Raja Vidya Raja Guhyam, the king of all knowledge and the king of all secrets. So love is kind of a hidden treasure. The word treasure appears many times there, something very confidential. And creation, in our tradition, we'll say also creation, as I said so far. There's one line, Kamas Tada Gre, in the Rig Veda, which means in the beginning, as in the Bible, they said in the beginning it was the word. The Rig Veda says in the beginning it was desire
Mm,
in the mind of God.
mm,
So in the mind of God there was a desire, and out of that desire the one became many. That's also a famous line in our tradition. The one became many, and it could be connected to what you just mentioned, in the context of to spread the news or the good news about love, the hidden treasure to make itself known, and not only to make itself known, but to know itself even more. We in our tradition will say that God again is still discovering his own self,
mm,
exploring his own self, which is infinite and unlimited. So through the interaction with each one of us, through the material disclosure, all that helps for this further divine self-discovery, so to say. And in the context of that, we are given a chance to discover ourselves, to discover God, to discover everything anew. Yeah.
mm.
So a few words, Abdi, of course, again, so much more could be said, but I don't want to take
Yeah.
too much time. But thank you so much. I appreciate the hadith.
Yeah. It's also that it's also reminding me of the idea of the pearl of great price, and what is that the one treasure that when you find it, everything else falls away. Nothing else has any meaning compared to that small treasure that is found.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Beautiful.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I wanted to mention the topic of the upcoming event. Ortline was mentioned earlier, and that Tim is going to be on the panel responding to Swami Padmanabha's book, and I'll also be there talking about the book Renewing Faith, that Process in Faith published very recently, and many other people in this community will be at that event. And I see Jared put that link in the chat to the eventbrite.com link to that event Ortline. So if you're interested in hearing from many people talking in the kind of process and open and relational tradition, or this kind of idea of evolutionary theologies, then that might be an event you'd be interested in. But in the meantime, let's just all thank our speaker, Swami Padmanabha, for coming to be with us this evening and to share this beautiful wisdom and knowledge that you've brought to this group. We are so appreciative of you and of the writing you are doing, and it's so joyful to find sister traditions, like you say, that we can be in relationship with and discover commonalities and new things, together. And so I'm very grateful for your presence here this evening. And of course, this event is being recorded, and so this conversation will be posted to our YouTube channel, and everyone that's registered will receive a link to that. But I'm sure there'll be a large audience out there in YouTube land to watch this after the fact of its recording tonight. So again, we are so grateful, and thank you all for being here. And please come back to another Process in Faith event in the future and sign up for our list and learn about what we're doing. There's learning circles that you can be part of on a monthly basis in conversation, or book groups, all kinds of ways to immerse yourself in this kind of discovery. So again, thank you so much, Swami, and we will see you another time.
Thank you. See you soon.
Thanks. Good night, all.